Okay, folks. So good afternoon and welcome back after your Christmas and New Year's break. I hope everyone had a lovely, peaceful, restful, and non-flu-like break over the last couple of days. It's been timely and indeed it's been, I suppose, a cold start to the year. So hopefully we'll warm up the fetlocks and get cracking with this wonderful opportunity to catch up in terms of all things procurement. So my name is Pat Downes. We're joined with Peter Brennan here today. Peter is the guru in all things OGP and procurement, and he's the chairman of Bid Services, which is a specialist consultancy who specialise in that particular area. And indeed, he's open for conversations with you after the module, and we'll have his details and we'll post it up. Just
Headline for this Monday
for
lunchtime.
information as well, if I can ask everyone to mute themselves, just for the avoidance of doubt. And equally, just to advise you, we're recording this module. It will be circulated afterwards via our normal channels, YouTube, LinkedIn, and so forth and so on. It'll be up on the website. This is an important module insofar as a lot of people aren't fully up to speed on the implications of the new OGP framework, which will have massive impact on, particularly on the SME consultancies who are looking to engage in terms of procurement in RFQs, RFTs with the state sector. It's seismic, I think it's fair to say. Now, I know it's not me you're here to see, so I'm going to hand over without any further ado to Peter, who's been kind enough to share his expert insight. But this really is the stuff of life for us, because if you are engaging in the state sector, this is going to have a significant potential impact on the way you do your business moving forward for the next 4 to 5 years. Peter, without further ado, Akara, I'm going to hand over to you. We're going to have questions at the end, if that's okay, and we've got some in already. So I'll be sharing those, and we'll open up to the forum later on. So we're running to time, running to order, and Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Pat, and wish everyone a happy new year and a prosperous and profitable new year. And what better way to be profitable than to bid into the OGP framework, which was published on the 4th of December. The first caveat is I'm giving you good advice in good faith. It's up to your individual selves to consider the documentation in detail. I'm not giving legal advice. I'm giving you my best interpretation of what is a very complicated document. There is already a framework in place, as you know, so I'm going to do a little bit of compare and contrast as to what the current framework looks like and what the new framework looks like. The coverage of the framework is quite important in terms of the different lots, of which there are 13. The content of the tender response documents I'm going to cover in detail, particularly with a view to making sure that if you do decide to submit, that you submit in a compliant manner. There are various selection criteria that we'll cover, and I'm also going to cover how the framework will operate in practice. So assuming you get on the framework, how it will run once it's set up. And last but by no means least, I have submitted, as indeed others have, certain very important clarification questions to the OGP, and we'll talk a little bit about the importance of clarification questions towards the tail end. I'm very happy to take questions en route, so to speak. So if I'm going through a particular section and you want to pop in, please do so.
Maybe just to that end, Peter, from logistics, if people use the chat box, we'll pick it up there.
Yeah, well, I probably won't see the chat box. If you could direct the questions to me, appreciate that. First of all, this is a very large valued tender. It's 350 million euros over the 4-year term of a framework. Any company that is eligible and has the capacity and expertise can apply for any of the 13 lots. In the last framework, there were 13 lots. They're more or less the same. They're divided into lower value contracts and higher value contracts by lot. So up to 199,000 euros, that's a new limit. Competitions will be awarded by way of a cascade system. The cascade system is basically whoever is the highest tender gets the first opportunity to bid by way of direct award, and up to 15 companies will be picked. So if you get number 1, you get the first opportunity, and then when opportunity 16 comes up, you'll get perhaps a second opportunity. More about the cascade system a bit later on. Mini competitions, which is not a direct award, which means that everyone who is a framework member is invited to tender, will apply to all contracts over 100,000. There's an option to use cascade or framework depending on what the contracting authority wants to do. It's also possible for a contracting authority to use this framework on behalf of other contracting authorities. So if, for example, a local authority wished to procure consultancy services on behalf of all other local authorities, it's only necessary for one local authority to run a tender competition on behalf of multiple framework clients, which is a positive thing, of course. On the other hand, up to 35 people, 35 companies will qualify per lot. That is way at the top end of what might normally be considered reasonable in running frameworks of this type, and I'll come back to that issue in a minute. It is not mandatory when you're looking at a particular lot that you have and are delivering all the services in that lot. That's pretty clear, and that's been clarified. But if you offer the majority or a significant number of services within the lot you're interested in, then obviously with your ability to submit comparable projects, you should and will be submitting a tender for that lot. If you're not in the framework, all things being equal, you will not be asked to tender for government work, for business consultancy services and ICT support for the next 4 years. There's a very strict rule in place since last June that all contracting authorities must use frameworks, and there's a very strong burden of proof on them if they decide not to. So the working assumption here is that all public bodies that are covered by this framework will use it for the next 4 years. So if you're in, good. If you're not, you won't be getting government work, or don't expect to get government work in this area of business management and ICT consultancy for the next 4 years. I think I need to be pretty honest at the outset. This is a very complicated framework. I would even argue in some respects it's over-engineered. It is not particularly user-friendly for the smaller business. It is not much different for the larger scale tenders, but for smaller scale businesses, it is quite complicated. The burden of compliance to get into the framework is actually high. Also very interestingly, and there's a big difference, the weighting on price now is at 600 or 60%. It was 30%. And when you price to get into the framework, your prices are fixed. There's a minor element for inflation, which I'll talk about. So when you bid your price to get into the framework and to be one of those highest ranking tenderers, the prices are fixed for the next 4 years. Now, it seems attractive at 350 million, but when you break down the annual amounts in some of the smaller lots, the annual value is actually quite low. It's less than 2 million. It's divided by 200 or 300 contracting authorities. There's no idea as to what the value of contracts will be. So the expectation as to how many contracts will be issued could be quite low in some of these smaller value contracts. So quite honestly, if you have 35 members on a framework, that basically defeats the whole purpose of the framework, because the framework is only supposed to have maybe 10, 15 at most. But for some reason, the OGP has now expanded the framework to cover practically everyone who applies, to be honest. Now, this is good news for the public service because obviously it's going to generate a fierce amount of price competition. But it also means that if you're one of the 35, statistically, the probability of you winning tenders will reduce commensurately. The cascade system applied in the past, it will continue to apply, but instead of having 5 companies, there will be 15 companies. And I'm going to explain this particular feature, which may mean that if there are, say, 25 tender competitions in the next 4 years, you'll be lucky perhaps for contract values under 199,000 to get perhaps 2 tenders. Just 2. Now that's quite a low hit rate for a lot of effort to get into the framework. And a big issue, which I'll talk about in a minute, is the revision of the insurance limits for professional indemnity, which would be very burdensome to my mind for smaller firms. So the first thing you need to do is to get the documentation. You're all registered on eTenders, and the documentation is as this screenshot. There will be additional documents added. There already has been an additional document added for the first set of clarification questions, and every time there are further clarification questions, they'll be added to this the tender documentation. So wherever you do, you need to download the request for tender. There are 3 tender response documents, and there are 4 appendices that you need to have on your file if you're going to be uploading and completing these documents. Who are the framework clients? Well, this hasn't changed much. The main thing is it's all of government apart from the utilities. The big port companies, the ESBs, the Irish Waters, they are not covered by this framework. That's a very important clarification. And they are one of the biggest spenders. They would spend nearly 50%, I'm sure, more than the rest of government on consultancy, but they are out of scope. The categories of consultants involved hasn't changed. They're obviously certified management consultants, recognized IMCA members or equivalent. So that hasn't changed. So everyone who's on the call is eligible to participate in the framework. There are 13 lots, basically broken down by subcategories. I'm not going to go through all of the particular sub-items. You can check out that from the RFT, the request for tender document, but it's broken down in lots 1 to 6, which are lower value tenders up to 199,000, and 7 to 13, which are higher value tenders. So they're in different categories. The first category is business strategy and operations. The second is organizational change management and transformation. The third is project, program, and portfolio management. Next is business process management, business process improvement, and process re-engineering. ICT, policy and economics, and generally multidisciplinary services. More or less as was the case in the previous framework, which, by the way, only existed for 2 years, and they're now re-tendering it. The previous framework only having run its course for 2 years, which is, again, a bit unusual. What is out of scope, and this hasn't changed, are market research and consultancy services, procurement, engineering-related consultancies, accounting, audit, and financial and economic services and strategy, and a couple of other areas, including the review of public spending code or investment guideline projects by the external assurance process, and some other ICT technical. So there's what's in scope and also, very importantly, what's out of scope. Take you through some of the key features. Every single government tender, as you know, has minimum insurances, as does this. The employer liability is standard, the public liability is standard, but professional indemnity was 150,000 for the lower value contracts. It's now gone to 500,000. And the value for professional indemnity for the higher value contracts has also increased. And the cyber insurance limits have increased as well. And it is compulsory to have these insurances if you are a framework member. You do not need to have them to apply, but once you are a framework member, you will be asked for certificates to prove that you have these insurances. So it's not necessary to have them at this point in time. Very important to have a sense as to what the estimated value of the contracts are. It's a very big issue, bid, no bid. So take, for example, policy and economics, 7 million over 4 years. But for business process management, it's 3.5 million. Divided by 35 companies over 4 years, there could be slim pickings here. And that's going to be a big decision for some of the smaller firms, for the lots 1 to 6, to see, given the number of potential framework members or successful tenderers, what's the statistical likelihood that you're going to get maybe 2 opportunities to fulfill a tender competition. And when you do get the opportunity to fulfill a tender competition, it could be a low value tender competition. because the cascade system will be run in strict order of marking. So you're not even guaranteed, if you get the highest placed tender, that you will get the highest value contract. Timelines are important. The deadline for clarification questions is the 9th of January, later this week. And it's very important to, and I'll come back to the clarification questions at the end of the presentation. Clarification questions have legal effect. So if the OGP responds X, Y, and Z, that has legal effect, and you should take and monitor the responses to the clarification questions extremely, extremely carefully, because quite often the tender documentation is tweaked in response to tenderers' questions. The submission deadline is the 30th. There has already been a clarification question as to whether this could be extended, and the OGP responded no. So Thursday the 30th is an absolute deadline. And the framework will apply under the Public Contracts Directive for 4 years. That's standard. So what are the compliance requirements? First of all, you have to submit a European Single Procurement Document. You'll be familiar with the European Single Procurement Document. There's guidance available. I'll come to that in a minute. You must complete what's called a tender response document. There are 3. The first tender response document, document A, only needs to be completed once. It's available in Word, and you can basically edit in your responses. And I'm going to go take you through tender response document A in a short while. You must sign the tenderer statement, which is Appendix 3, on headed paper and upload it separately on eTenders. You must sign what's called a pro bono declaration, Appendix 8, again on headed paper, and upload it onto eTenders. That's if you're applying for higher value contracts. You must complete a new declaration. It's the first time I've ever seen this, an AI declaration, again, and upload it on eTenders. You then proceed to complete tender response document B. I'm going to take you through this document as well in a bit of detail. And you have to submit a separate TRD for each lot that you're applying for. So if you're applying for all 13, there's a lot of work involved. But if you're only applying for 2 lots, which most people will be, it's going to be fairly straightforward because, for example, the project case histories or reference sites you're using for smaller value tenders can be used for higher value tenders and vice versa. You also have to complete a pricing schedule, which is standard for all tenders. This is response document C. And I'm going to take you through the Excel spreadsheet that has been published on eTenders. You do not need to complete what's called the declaration as to personal circumstances, which is Appendix 4. And I've asked a clarification question to make sure that you do not need to complete what's called the Foreign Subsidies Regulations Declaration. That's in the standard OGP documents, but it's not needed if the value of the contract is less than 250 million. So that limit does not apply to any of the lots under reference. The documents must be text searchable by the OGP evaluators, and there are certain protocols about saving documents and not using certain characters. But that's all in the RFT. Pay attention, because the last thing you want is done a lot of work to get your tender documents up. You save it in the wrong way and it can't be uploaded on eTenders. And that's your problem, not the OGP's problem. The ESPD is common. You've used this all the time. The most important thing that I should like to bring to your attention is that if you're relying on another consultancy company or named individuals, and they are going to be an important part of your submission, or you're amalgamating different practices, bidding together as a consortium, all subcontractors must also submit the ESPD. A lot of people forget that, and that is a compliance pass-fail issue. So your subcontractors don't complete this, it could be potentially a problem. Effectively, in the European Single Procurement Document, it covers what are called the exclusion criteria. You declare you're not bankrupt, you declare you're solvent, you declare you pay your taxes, you pay your social security, you're not involved in fraud, abuses of X, Y, and Z, etc. So it's called the exclusion criteria. And only one needs to be completed for this program, for this particular tender. So complete the document as instructed. When you're finished, you press the finish button and it's uploaded. So let's go to the tender response documents. The first, you see, they're available. I've done screenshots just basically to facilitate you, facilitate the presentation. You have to indicate what lots, and you can see very clearly it's in yellow. You go into that box and it'll go tick, and you tick the relevant box. Now, you have to indicate if you're bidding for the lower value tenders as to what cascade system you're opting for. So you have to basically fill A or B, and you'll come to that. We'll come to that now in a short while. Tender response document A is basically an affirmatory document. It's basically saying, if you see in the first, yes, we have completed the pricing schedule. We have submitted our tenderer statement. We have submitted on A4 the ESPD. If we're relying on other entities, we have letters available and will supply letters available to the OGP if requested, explaining the relationship that we have with our subcontractors. You indicate in relation to Appendix 4 that if requested, and probably you won't be requested because it's not really relevant anymore, Appendix 4 will be signed. And the pro bono declaration has to be signed. Basically, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute, is committing you to spend a certain amount of time or money on pro bono activities. There has to be an artificial intelligence declaration signed, and you just basically confirm that you have signed it, dated it, if necessary, put it on headed paper and uploaded it separately. So this is basically tender form A is a very important checklist.
Peter, if I can just interrupt for one moment to clarify, Shelley has just asked to clarify that TRDB should be submitted for each lot, or is it for each CCPA, e.g. 1 and 7, and can be submitted together? Is that correct?
It's for each lot.
For each lot. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Just to continue in TRD-A, the economic and financial, you indicate the turnover figures. As you can see, you'll have to complete them, and you'll also certify that if requested, and you will be requested, your auditor will give a suitable letter to explain and verify that these turnover figures apply, and indeed, where relevant for the higher value tenders, that the solvency ratio will apply. You basically, your auditor or accountant will be asked to verify that your business is in good standing. Under Section 7, you then have to complete different projects, project reference sites. And these are really, really important. So you have to think very carefully. If you're bidding for an economics lot, you have to demonstrate how previous work for doing economic consultancy has worked well for the public or private sector clients, and how relevant it is to this particular framework. And you can see down in the bottom of the page there what's called a comparability narrative. That's really important. In that particular section, you're writing to convince the evaluators that your reference sites are absolutely fit for purpose as they relate to the lot that you're bidding for. Now, you can use these reference sites for lower value tenders, also for higher value, for the higher value tenders, lots 7 to 13. There's a separate set of contracts that have to be completed. So 3 references are required for every lot tendered. Again, some of the lots are doubled up, 1 and 7. But from my reading of the RFT, you need to submit a TRD for every lot. And the higher value lots are lots 7 to 13, as I've mentioned. Now, the OGP has already clarified that you can use, if you had 2 or 3 very high value contracts, you can also use them for the lower value tenders you're bidding for. So you don't need to duplicate. Once you have your set of 3 high value contracts for contracts over 140,000, you can use them for contracts under 50,000. So basically you're cut and pasting. bottom line, you must make sure that these reference sites are fit for purpose. If they're not comparable and relevant, the evaluators have a right to deem them non-compliant. So don't just be putting in any old reference site in. It should be absolutely fit for purpose. If you're bidding into government on a regular basis, you will know that you have to sign a tender statement. That is still the case here. It has to be on your headed paper. And what you're effectively saying here is you accept the request for tender, you accept the contract terms, you will deliver the contract, your prices stand, and you accept all the other terms and conditions, including the clarification questions. This has to be signed, and failure to sign this document is a non-compliant issue. So whatever you do, put it on headed paper and sign it as instructed. You also have to declare, that's only the issue at the moment, declare that you have formal written procedures and policies in place with regard to client management, file and records management, cybersecurity, data protection and IT, and corporate social responsibility. Now, if you read the RFT in section 4.6, it states that while ISO certification is not essential, that these procedures must be aligned to ISO 9001, environmental management systems, governance of organizations, ISO 37000, and information security management. Now, I have asked a clarification question to the OGP as to whether it is proportionate to request all of these basically quasi-ISO standards for the lower value tenders, 1 to 6. To my mind, it is disproportionate to ask somebody to have an information security management system for lower value tenders. And certainly I don't see the logic of having small firms having to have an ISO standard for governance of organizations for lower value tenders. But you'd have to await the response of the OGP to see whether they agree with my interpretation or not. But if they do insist, you will have to declare that you have these ISO or equivalent standards in place. You can rely, as is common in tendering, on the capacity of other companies, individuals. You can merge, you can form a consortium. It is a consortium, it is the primary contractor that will complete the form. Subcontractors, as I mentioned earlier, must sign the European Single Procurement Document, and you will be asked for a duly evidenced statement in relation to the provision of capacity if requested. So, in other words, if you have 2 or 3 people working with you, the OGP reserves the right to get a statement of capacity from those individuals before they appoint you a framework member. But at this point in time, there's no need to have that document ready, but it may be required as part of their compliance check. Now, this is not a new requirement, having a pro bono voluntary declaration. There's a similar framework for legal services, and it was used for the framework for legal services. It is triggered if you win a services contract. Now, I'm not entirely clear if it applies to the lower value tenders. Again, a clarification question has been asked. So the assumption would be, take for example, for the higher value tenders, you have to provide a level 6 resource, which is at director level. It's a very senior, the most senior resource possible, for 20 hours of pro bono consultancy per annum, or up to 5% of the value of the contract. So if you win a 4-year contract, you'll probably be contributing 20% of the value of the contract in year 1 by way of pro bono services. So obviously you need to factor that into your pricing. That's quite a high requirement for basically quasi-fee income to be diverted into pro bono services. I'm not querying the issue of pro bono services because you're going to be helping charities, non-profit organizations, etc. It's just that in bidding, you need to take the time and the pricing costs involved into account in putting the pricing schedule together. And there is an annual obligation to report. Again, I've asked several clarification questions about this, which the OGP will respond to, I'm sure, in a short while.
Peter, we have two questions. I'll just catch them as they're kind of prescient over the last couple of slides. Sean was asking, in reference to Shelley's prior question, that it appears that only one TRD is required for each CCPA. So, for example, on page 31, section 3.31, it states if you're applying for lots 1 and 7, which is business strategy and operation, relatively low value and high value, submit one TRD Part B. So would it be, pertinent maybe to put in a CQ confirming that is the way to deal with this? Or has
Yes.
that been done?
Well, if I didn't pick that up, it's and my apologies, and I stand corrected. But again, it would be important to put a clarification question in, and I'll undertake to put a clarification question in after this call.
Thank you. Thank you. And Sean, I'm sure will appreciate that too. And Paul,
it would be logical that for the consultancy areas are there's two per consultancy areas, that only one TRD should be submitted, TRD B.
Yeah.
Sorry, and apologies for jumping in. I don't know if you encourage it, but it was just something I had looked up previously. This is Brian Norton here. And I actually have it. I have a little synopsis of it here in front of me. I can read it out really quickly. If that helps. Submission of tenders, and it's taken directly from the tender document. Submission of tenders for multiple framework agreement lots. It says tenderers are required to complete and submit a separate TRD Part B for every core consulting area that they are tendering for as per requirements set out in 2.6 of the RFT and as outlined in the tenderer's aid memoir. So it gives examples. If you were applying for lot 1 only, there will be one submitted TRD Part B. However, if you were submitting for 1 and 2, which are different, obviously, submit 2 separate TRDs. But if you were applying for example, 1 and 7, which in effect are the same CCEs, but they are just different values, then you will submit one TRD Part B.
That's clear.
Yeah.
That's crystal clear. So if you're submitting in the same category, the broad category, only one.
That's it. Yeah. And that's why I was saying, can you go back on that? Sorry, that was my question to go. Could you go back and say that again? So I think if they're the equivalent 1 and 7, 2 and 8, etc., barring number 13, then you have to submit just one TRD Part B.
That's fine. I stand corrected. That's good clarification.
All right. Well, thank you for that, both Sean and Brian. And Paul had a quick question for you as well, Peter, just while you're on the hot there. Is it possible, and I think I know the answer to this, to see previous framework participants, but I will ask for clarity, Peter. I didn't think so, but are they reflecting?
Answer, no, they're confidential. Only the public sector are given the list of successful framework members. You can get such information by way of the FOI, but normally the OGP won't release this information. They probably deem it commercially sensitive.
Yeah, I would have thought so. And that's my understanding as well. The pro bono piece we've just done, and I would be kind of very wary on that pro bono in terms of the hours, billable hours element of that. It's quite high, and I'm not sure what the precedent is across other spectrums in regards to that. I'm not arguing that it's a good thing, which it is clearly, but just to be aware of that the implication.
It's used for the legal services framework.
I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
It's been in existence now for the last 2 or 3 years. It's a standard feature in that.
At that level?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other question was, and I suppose it's an open, is in your opinion, Peter, are they open to having the smaller firms on the framework? You can choose to answer that or not as you wish, Peter.
I cover that now towards the end of the presentation.
Okay. And I think we covered off his last point as well. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt there, Peter. We might actually take the questions at the end. Actually, at this point, it might make more common sense rather than interrupt Peter's flow.
Okay. You also you may also be asked to submit reference letters to the OGP, again, as part of the compliance check requirement. You do not have to submit them with your bid, but you have to have them lined up. Now, my experience, and this is the standard format that the OGP has recommended, I have rarely seen a public sector official, however well intended they are, to issue a letter like this. And I've asked a clarification question as to whether the contracting authorities, several thousand of them as they are, have been asked to facilitate small firms and other practices that they seek these letters of references in this particular format and on their headed paper. And it has to be obviously not an email, it has to be a letter. So it's a bit of an administrative burden. So if, for example, 200 framework members qualified, there's going to be an awful lot of reference letters to be sought and submitted. But that's not required at this particular point in time in the submission process. The accountants you use have to be registered with the Irish Audit and Accounting Supervisory Authority or equivalent. You need to be very careful about what turnover you declare. In the request for tender, they give you working examples that if you're bidding for lot 1, the turnover is X. If you're bidding for lot 1, 3 and 7, it is a different formula and a different requirement. So just check out the worked examples to make sure that you have the required turnover. And also there are solvency declarations required, which is a new requirement, a newish requirement. Most companies would just get a certificate from their auditor. You also can rely on the turnover figures if you're of your subcontractors. You can combine them effectively, and also in respect of the solvency criterion. So it's quite common practice for 2 or 3 individuals or companies come together to bid that they can amalgamate or aggregate their accounts to achieve a higher level of turnover. Now, be very clear that you have to complete Form A exactly as instructed, because if you don't do it, it's non-compliant. There's no wriggle room. It's black or white. You comply or you don't comply. So let's move on to your tender response document B. Best practice in responding to any tenders is you read the instructions. Most people default, go straight into completing the document. Read the instructions in the first instance. So as we've clarified, a separate TRD is required for the categories that have been published, lots 1 and 7 all the way up, and separately for lot 13, which is the multidisciplinary category. There are only 2 non-price criteria. Last time around there were 3. So this is very unusual to qualify to get into a framework to have so few sub-criteria, but we'll talk about them in a second. There are strict page count limits. If you go over the page count limits, anything over the page count limits will not be evaluated. You're instructed to use Calibri font size 11. Don't use anything bigger. Populate the boxes strictly as instructed. You're not allowed to include hyperlinks, and any appendices that you have are other than those requested should not be enclosed with Form B. They won't be evaluated and they're not to be enclosed. So you also have to secure a minimum mark of 60% for the 2 non-price award criteria. So this is not at all unusual in qualifying for a framework. So this is fairly standard methodology. The first criteria is quality of service delivery methodology. Now, I've read this. There's 15 pages required. It's quite a lot. Look at the 3 bullet points. For each of the lots you're complying with, absolutely make sure that every single sub-criteria is covered in your response. For example, in the second bullet, your proposed approach to maintaining continuity of services in the team delivering the services to ensure the delivery of projects within timelines, budget, and scope. Now, you probably will be relying on the reference sites that you've given, and there's no reason why you can't. But whatever you do, read the requirements here as they apply to the lot you're bidding for. In your 15 pages, you can use graphics, obviously, use tables, use charts, give precedent examples, reference the quality assurance standards that you have, which are written into the document as appropriate. So it's pretty straightforward. 350 marks. The green public procurement criteria is the same, 50 marks. There is a government policy on green public procurement, which basically states that all government tenders over 50,000 euros from the 1st of January this year have to have green public procurement criteria. Now, this is slightly different. It's a quality of approach to sustainability, and it includes some social considerations, which are quite separate from green public procurement. Now, the green public procurement arrangements have not been implemented by way of a deeper circular, and I've asked 2 clarification questions about the legality of requiring some of these generic conditions for which are not contract specific. So when you set an award criteria, it has to be contract specific. So using recycled products and recycling facilities, how does that apply to bidding to get in as a framework member? I'm not quite sure. So I have asked clarification questions to make sure that the criteria here are contract specific, and also, like all award criteria, they're proportional. As you can see from the mentioned earlier on, there's a requirement of environmental management, ISO standards or equivalent. But is that really relevant to maybe an economics consultancy that's doing a small value contract that has nothing to do with the environment? So there's some requirements perhaps not as fit for purpose as may be the case. When the bids come in, and there's only 2 award criteria, this is the scoring methodology. You'd be familiar with it. What's very important is that for the cascade system, it is the highest ranking that will get the first cut at the first tenders that come in. So obviously the company that scores the most marks will get the highest ranking. The ranking for the higher value tenders doesn't matter, because you're put on the framework. You'll be one of 35 framework members, and when the user guide is issued to the potential users of the framework, typically they don't list who came first. They usually list the framework members in alphabetical order. Pay particular attention to the pricing criteria, commonplace in all government tenders. The rule here is whatever prices you bid are the maximum prices that you can apply, apart from some measure of inflation, for the duration of the framework. So if you bid in at €1,000 a day and there's a mini competition, you can't bid any more than €1,000 a day. You're also going to be asked to give a blended rate with a percentage allocated per consultant. So you're going to have to play around with the figures to see how it works. You're also going to be asked to submit what your normal rates are. And the reason the OGP are looking for this is they want to be able to compare, if contracts are issued in future, what the saving element is. So in other words, if they give a contract to company X that's valued at 100K, but in normal circumstances, that company would have charged 140K, the saving to the exchequer is putatively 40K. So that's why they're looking for that information. So read the instructions very carefully, as you do when you're submitting tender bids, and beware that there's a separate pricing schedule for each lot. Okay, so make sure you probably should be considering pricing differently for different lots, for higher value contracts or for lower value contracts. That's part of your pricing strategy. You will see the grades on the left side that correspond with the grades in the Excel spreadsheet. So obviously managing director partner, subject matter expert, 15 years experience is the top end. And these are the people who'll be doing the pro bono work. So all the way down to junior analyst. And very interestingly, if you see in level 0, you have to price for a trainee or an apprentice. Now, I've asked a clarification question, is that appropriate for small businesses? Because very few small businesses, to my mind, certainly those employing less than 20 people, would have apprentices or trainees, but they have to price for one, and they have to have one potentially. because it's part of the pricing arrangements. The working day is 7.5 hours. That's not at all unusual. You can downfill. So if you don't have staff at all levels, you can downfill a higher resource to a lower price level, but you can't upfill. Obviously, all these costs exclude VAT. VAT is never taken into account in evaluating Irish government tenders. Travel and subsistence will be a matter for contracting authorities to clarify when they issue their tenders subsequently. And as I mentioned, to identify savings, you're asked to submit a pre-tender daily rate. Now, there is a provision for inflation, 4% on the second anniversary of the framework agreement and 2% on the third anniversary. So there's a little bit of inflation added for it, which is a positive. Now, when these supplementary requests for tender come out, the contracting authorities may specify what rates they want charged. Could they fixed rate, daily rate, blended rate? And just refer to section 210.6 of the RFT. And obviously, the way the calculation is very straightforward. The tender that submits the lowest cost for that lot gets the maximum marks available, 600. And if you bid 10% more expensively, you lose 10% of 600. You lose 6%. So that will be taken into account. And there's a very high weighting on price, 60%, which is extremely high. There's a tie-break rule. Don't need to go into it, but there is a tie-break rule. If you're a successful candidate, let's presume everyone on the call is, you will be asked as part of the notification letter you get to provide evidentiary documents. At that stage, you absolutely will need to have your insurance certificates, including cyber and enhanced professional indemnity, ready to go. You'll have 7 days typically to submit these documents to the OGP. And they will also check out and you'll give them their tax clearance certificate. You will be asked to sign a framework agreement, and this is the one that's attached to the RFT, and a confidentiality agreement. You only sign a services contract if you win a contract. It's part of the tender documents, but you only sign that following a mini competition or a cascade arrangement. So when the evaluation is completed, the OGP will send what's called a user guide to all of the contracting authorities that are eligible to use this framework. They will tell these companies how to use it. They'll explain the cascade system, the options available. They list all the framework members per lot. They will enclose relevant working documents, including standard TRDs, supplementary requests for tender, and notification activation forms. So effectively, the user guide, which is confidential to the contracting authorities, will enable them to draw down the framework once it's operational. It'll take quite a while, believe you me, for this to be evaluated. If this framework is operational by April, I'd be very surprised, because the number of bids coming in, it'll take quite some time. Typically, it takes 2 to 3 months to evaluate a complex a framework like this. But I would want to emphasize one point. The contracting authorities have a new rule since last June, Deeper Circular 9/2024. They must use OGP frameworks. And if they don't, there has to be a really good justification for not using it. And if they don't use it, typically this will have to go to a risk and audit committee, and it's reportable. So there's a higher burden of requirement on contracting authorities to use frameworks. And typically they run the tender competitions themselves. The OGP used to do this in the past, but due to resource constraints, typically individual contracting authorities will run their own tender competitions. How will the cascade work? It's quite complicated. So as I understand it, the top 15 highest scoring ranked tenders in lots 1 to 6 would be eligible for cascades. They have to opt. There are different bands. You have to decide which band you want to go into. And if a contracting authority decides to use a cascade, they will send the framework member that is the highest ranking with what's called a notification to activate services form. And you will get a few short days, I think it's 5 days, to respond to this. There'll be specifications. You have to basically respond, giving extra detail, giving your prices. And if they're accepted, you'll get the gig. This is a direct award of contract. So only one company gets the option of running this contract. You've no guarantee that the contract will be 100,000, 10,000, or 1 million. It's just wherever you are listed in this rank. Then when you're working on that, the second place company on the cascade gets the next opportunity that comes out. And so all the way down the line. Now, what I am not sure of, if, for example, you had resource constraints and you were offered an opportunity, you literally didn't have the bandwidth to do it at that point in time, and you're company number one, and you don't respond for those reasons, do you then have to go all the way back to the end of the queue? So in other words, you won't get another contract by way of direct drawdown until contract number 16 comes out. And you have to ask yourself, how many contracts are likely to issue per lot? Now, I've asked the OGP to give a breakdown as to what the current drawdown of contracts have been per lot, which, if that data is provided, will give everyone an idea as to what the likely volume of business is likely to be.
Sean, sorry, it's just Brian again there. I don't have the direct quote from it, but my understanding, and I could be wrong on this one, was that in every instance for the direct award or the cascade, it will always be offered to the number one ranked vendor. Every time it won't go to number two unless number one says they're not able to fulfill it, can't fulfill it, and there's a process around that. And if they say they can't do it, and that time goes by, it gets offered to number two. And then if the same thing happens, number three and number four, and if you happen to be number 15, then it'll probably never get to you, if you get me. So again, every time it'll go to number one was my reading of it.
That's normally what a cascade system is. That the first listed tender gets everything. But the way this is designed, my interpretation is that there are 15 people on the cascade, and the idea is that it will cascade down to each of these. Again, if it's a matter of interpretation, let's submit a clarification question just to be double sure. If your interpretation is correct, then there's even less likelihood of companies winning. And I don't see how a winner takes all for low value tenders is in the interest of anyone. It's not in the interest of competition, certainly. But let me double check what the RFT states, and if needs be, I'll submit a clarification question. That's a hugely important issue. Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
The document allows you to, gives the contracting authority the option of looking for a fixed price contract, a daily rate, or a blended rate. And my understanding is that the opportunity will pass the second and subsequently ranked tenders if the chosen framework member does not revert and doesn't sign an NASF within 5 working days. So there's a very strict requirement. If you are asked and you're served with an NASF, a notification to service form, that you respond almost immediately, because if you don't, the rules are it passes to the next person almost within a week, well, a 1 working week, which is a pretty tight deadline to turn a documentation around. You've no guarantee that the contract will be 10,000, 100,000, or 1 million. No allowance is made for the fact that it could be a very complicated consultancy assignment. For many competitions, it's fairly straightforward. Every single framework member must be invited when there's a mini competition used. So you have the option of bidding or not bidding, but everyone who is a qualified listed framework member will get a supplementary request for tender via e-tenders for all contracts, in this case valued over 100K. So it's open business. So there could be 35 companies listed, which is normally in frameworks you don't have. I've never seen a framework with 35 companies before. Typically it's only 10, 15. Certainly the legal services framework, they limited the number of framework members, typically between 10 and 15. And if you win a contract, you get a services contract. You have to sign it. And the services contract will be the one that's attached to the current RFT, request for tender. Supplementary requests for tender would be based on 4 award criteria: cost, anything up to 80%, sustainability, up to 20%, although the OGP, the Green Public Procurement Guidance says 5% typically for professional services contracts, contract management and delivery, up to 40%. Very interestingly, contract management was an award criteria to get into the last framework. It isn't in this. And the merits of the team and relevant resources. So the number of award criteria are quite few, which is good. It basically means when you have to complete your tender response documents, they're not going to be very long, and they'll all be page count limited. At mini competition stage, not now, you may be asked to consider social considerations in procurement. And not now, but before you get into active tendering, brief yourself as to what's happening in government about social considerations in procurement. There's quite a few documents floating around. There's a deeper circular from 2019 that's in the process of being changed at the moment, but there's best practice guidelines in Northern Ireland. There's, for example, an apprenticeship plan, and I'd say the programme for government is also going to include some elements of social considerations, which you may be asked to factor into your tender submission bids subsequently. Contract management is very important for the public sector, and every framework member will be asked to appoint a key account manager at the level of partner. There's going to be a lot of reporting required. You're going to have to provide oversight as to explain how the contracts are going to be delivered. There's ISO requirements in relation to quality assurance. There's ISO requirements in relation to environmental management procedures. And there's very formal procedures in the framework agreement and services contracts about how the contracts will be delivered. And in some cases, Garda vetting will be required. Ask clarification questions. Best practice is you ask clarification questions. You cannot bid unless you are, as a reasonably well-informed tender, you know how to price the bid, you understand the potential volume of work, you understand the risks, you know fully well what is available or not available. Now, there has already been one response just Christmas Eve to the first set of clarification questions. It is absolutely essential that you read the questions and the responses because they're contractually binding. And for example, prior to Christmas, there was some clarification sought about pro bono and what this meant. And again, the OGP has done its best to get the tender documentation as correctly as it can, but people interpret documents, as we have this morning, in different ways. So it's very important to, if there's a difference of interpretation, to clarify it. And I certainly will issue a separate clarification question now about the cascade system after this call. I've issued loads of questions, as is my wont. I think I've been taken off the OGP Christmas card list as a result. But I think when we advise tenderers, it is really important that they understand what they're letting themselves in for. Like, I fundamentally didn't understand why just 2 years after a 4-year framework was issued, we have a new one. Now, typically, I've asked a question, can the market engagement report be published? It should be. There's nothing confidential in it because everyone who submitted responses did so on a non-confidential basis. I've also asked a lot of detail about the potential flow of work based on historical contracts, not looking for the names of any contracts, but basically saying, like, for example, how many owner managers or small businesses have won contracts in the current framework. And suggesting, for example, that the limit of 199,000 is perhaps on the high side based on what other frameworks have done. Asking them also to justify the significant increase in professional indemnity insurance as it relates to comparable tenders for other consultancy services.
Yeah.
seems to me to be proportionately higher than it is the case in some other tenders that I've seen issued in the recent past. So I've asked also to clarify the cascade system. I've also asked to maybe they should differentiate the selection criteria required, as I think Pat mentioned earlier on. Having ISO standards for governance for small businesses isn't really relevant, but it is perhaps relevant for lots 1 to 7, or from 7 to 13. And I've asked the OGP to consider to basically differentiate between the higher requirements for 7 to 13 compared to 1 to 6. I don't believe the declaration of personal circumstances needs to be issued. It's superfluous. I also don't understand, and this is the first time I've ever seen in a government tender, a requirement for everyone to sign a declaration on artificial intelligence. You're being asked the extent to which you use AI to make your bid. And I'm presuming as well that when supplementary requests for tender are issued, you're going to be asked to declare every time you write a tender in future the extent to which you've used AI. I'm not sure what the legal basis of this is, and it's certainly not a procurement rule. Also as well, I've asked the OGP to clarify, have they engaged with potential contracting authorities to facilitate tenderers who have to get all these letters of reference in a prescribed format? Talk about pro bono. The quality assurance processes, to my mind, are disproportionate, and under the procurement rules, you must set proportional requirements. That is one of the core principles of procurement. So setting disproportionate requirements for low-value contracts potentially could challenge the entire framework because they're disproportionate. It's up to the OGP now to respond to these, to explain that they're not disproportionate. For example, the requirement to have the equivalent of ISO 37000 for small firms, I don't see the relevance and proportionality of this at all, etc. So I've asked a lot of clarification questions, and hopefully in the next week they'll be responded to. If you've got clarification questions yourselves, ask them, and do so before the deadline later in the week. You will not be able to change the contract. You may ask for changes. The OGP will tell you that the Chief State Solicitor's Office has approved the framework agreement, the confidentiality agreement, and the services contract, and they're not negotiable. There are remedies in the services contract. They're standard remedies. So if you don't deliver a contract or fail to deliver, you might get fees deducted, etc. Most importantly of all, if you don't become a framework member, you will not get access to this €350 million business opportunity over the next 4 years. Now, that said, do you bid? Do you not bid? And the purpose of today's briefing is to give you the elements as to what may inform you whether to bid or not to bid. For some companies that might be on the very small consultancies, this may be something that is a bit too complicated, but for the larger scale consultancy practices, is certainly in nearly every case is going to be a bid decision. While the documentation requirements are complicated, you are in the system. And I think it's very important for marketing purposes, if no other, to be able to tell your private sector clients and others that you are a framework member for Lot X approved by the OGP. That particular marketing statement would be very important. And it's also important that you be able to get public sector reference sites for future work. The document as drafted is very complicated and a little bit disproportionate for lower value, lower sized firms. There are 35 members eligible per lot. It doesn't mean there will be 35 appointed, but up to 35. And that is extremely unusual. I don't think I've ever seen an Irish government framework with as many members. So effectively, it's going to result in an awful lot of administrative burden on the contracting authorities that are running these tender competitions, that they have to send them to 35 different companies. It would have been easier to advertise it on e-tenders. So it's going to be a very major compliance burden for the public sector, and in turn for everyone else. So for example, 20 bids are submitted and each bid costs €5,000 and there's only one winner. There's a lot of time going to be spent writing tender bids. And when you write a tender bid, you should take the cost of writing the tender bid into account, because that's some of your profit margin gone. There will be fierce price competition. And the mandate of the Office of Government Procurement, quite correctly, is to get value for money. And certainly the way this framework is constructed, they will get value for money. With such a high weighting on cost, 60% to get into the framework, and they are the maximum rates that apply. So be mindful of that when you are putting your tender response documents together, particularly on the pricing. But you have to price to be profitable.
Peter, thank you so much. That was really, really insightful, and it's thrown up a lot of questions. I'll throw it open into the audience. Yeah. But I mean, one of the things that struck me there, there's been a lot of talk over the period, I suppose, about proportionality, for example. I think there was a circular back in March or April back in 2023, kind of emphasizing that. From what you've just said, that seems to fly in the face of that in terms of inclusion for the SME sector.
Yes, and it's up to the OGP to explain on foot of these clarification questions that they believe that the rules have set are proportional. They have to do that. The Circular 05/2023, the one you referred to, basically says that it's a standard procurement principle that has applied the last 20 years, but the requirements have to be proportional to the risk and the value of the contract. So the OGP have completed market engagement exercise, so they have a very good sense as to what the market can and can't do, and they've obviously responded with these requirements. Arguably disproportionate, but it's up to them to determine whether they are or not.
Okay, and in terms of, I mean, for example, professional indemnity insurance is becoming a real bugbear now with, providers leaving the market. It's kind of constricting that evolution in terms of pricing, in terms of the levels required, commensurate with the scale of the potential contract, seems to be out of kilter. What's your view on that?
It's at the higher end. I look at requests for tender across every area of government, not just business, and this is at the higher end. Now, the State Claims Agency would have advised the Office of Government Procurement in that particular piece of advice that probably has fed its way into this tender. Again, I would hope when the OGP responds, they will justify the reason for the increase.
Okay.
And they have to justify the reason for the increase, because again, the procurement rule is that any quote, and the jargon is, any reasonably well-informed tenderer must have full facts and evidence available to them to enable them to decide whether to bid or not. And if you see a fully justified reason for PI insurance, that's a good justification. Then you have to weigh up whether you want to bid or not. But the justification has to be given to you. And so that's a basic procurement rule. So that's why I've asked so many questions of the OGP, to give them the opportunity to provide the evidence that what's being put here is proportional, reasonable, and evidence-based.
And again, within that context, in that, say, for example, the sustainability or green procurement, and there was some directives given, but it was around the 5% level going back 3 or 4 maybe years ago. It was never really kind of, I suppose, it never got traction. That's quite a leap forward now. And when you combine that again with the pro bono, and also you combine that with, I've never seen interns or I suppose that kind of apprenticeship piece in a tender before. Have you seen that before?
No, but it's happening, and there's a government policy on apprenticeships, and all this is doing is implementing it through the tendering process. Okay. So there will be and understandably so, a push on the private sector to take, not just in the construction area, but for professional consultancy bodies to take more trainees and take more apprentices. And that's part of what's going to happen as part of there's a new emphasis going to be given probably next year on social considerations in procurement, which is in addition to green public procurement. And there may even be a minimum mark for social considerations in procurement where it's proportionate, and absolutely where it's contract specific.
Okay.
Policy on sustainable green public procurement is from the 1st of January this year, all government contracts over €50,000 must have green public procurement. That is contract specific and proportionate.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, I get that. Now, I'm not disputing it's a good thing, but it's it has HR and cost implications.
Again, the point is you have to factor that into your price.
Okay. Okay, can I ask any of our colleagues that are on the call, have you any supplementary questions for Peter? I'm conscious that he's given a lot of his time to us, and I have to say, really, I'm going to look forward to going back over this again over the next day or so and working through my notes. You've given us huge food for thought, but out of courtesy to our colleagues that are sitting on, Sean, Brian, Paul, anyone else, Shelley, any questions you want to ask while we have Peter on the hot seat?
No, I just want to compliment Peter on an excellent presentation. I would share his views and his concerns on proportionality, suitability and applicability of the framework agreement to the smaller practices that are out there. So I'd be added him with them on that. So I just want to say well done to Peter. It was excellent.
Thank you, Sean.
And I'd like to echo that as well, Patrick and Peter. Thanks so much, Paul Ryan here. It's much appreciated, and I think I've spoken to other consultancy firms, and I think a lot of them don't even know it's out there at the moment. You know what I mean? Which even the time frame now means it's even tighter for them to get their head around it. We've been looking at this since December, still in that no bid sort of decision making. Obviously, it's getting tighter now, so it does seem for, I suppose, the lower tier consultancies, that are not big four, big five, like it does seem really challenging to scale into it. And we currently have a lot of really good public sector clients who have been using us because of our special capability, if you like, but even for them, our contacts in those organizations are saying we just haven't got the diktat from procurement yet, but I've no doubt they will in terms of how they need to buy into the future. So, while they're very happy with the service they're getting from us, they're, they could be prohibited from dealing with us just through this fact, and I think that's a real challenge for us and lots of other mid-tier consultancy firms that are out in the market there, It just the read of it and just really leans towards bigger gets more, and that's I suppose that's the real worry here. And you hear sentiment that you're trying to expand it and support the small guy, but it just does seem quite prohibitive, I would have thought. That's just my read of it. I know I kind of put you on the spot, Peter, to answer that question, but I just get there's a massive amount in this to scale up into it,
It's very complicated.
Okay, look, Peter, very conscious of your time. Thank you so much. And on behalf of all here and all who'll be watching it later, the members and so forth of the Institute, Gramil Mila Mahagat Akara, I hope that the new year is a healthy one for both you and for all who are watching this and will watch it in the future. We look forward to the next module that's coming up over the next couple of weeks. And all that remains for me to do is to release you back into the wild, perhaps get a cup of coffee, Peter. Well deserved. And wish you all a happy new year. Gramil Mahagat.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.